Welcome to the Normal to Nomad podcast, where we share stories, thoughts, ideas, and conversations on our journey to find balance with nature in a technologically advanced world. My name is Baron.
And I'm Elsa. We live together in a 13-foot scamp trailer with our dog camp in the American wilderness.
Greetings. Welcome to today's podcast. We're coming at you from Montana. Elsa is currently editing a video of our fly fishing trip. We spent 5-6 days off-grid camping and fly fishing, and we have sort of a documentary style video coming up, so that should be pretty exciting. I'm sitting here with Andrew Crowe. He and I met, like 6 months ago, something?
Yeah, it was a while ago, yeah.
And we've been talking over Instagram and stuff, and he said once we come up to Montana, we gotta hang out and fly fish, and he'd show us all the spots. So we went with he and his girlfriend and her brother to some backcountry in Montana to go fly fishing and geek out in the wilderness, and it's been a blast. And a lot of our conversations got to the point where I was like, man, we gotta share this. This is really fun. So hopefully you enjoy. Greetings, Andrew. Welcome.
Thank you.
Where should we start? I guess brief introduction of you know, where are you at currently? I think it's interesting what you studied, that kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, so I went to college for cell biology and neuroscience, and so the previous plan was to actually be applying to medical school about a year ago and kind of following that route. But the more and more that I realized, what that would actually be like, the real life aspect of being a doctor, I've kind of steered away from that. And so in my free time now, I've been working at a medical office doing stem cell injections and laser therapy, so alternative modalities for healthcare.
So what does that mean?
Just using different technologies that you can use, so regenerative as opposed to the standard means to actually treat disease or whatever the case may be. Generally speaking, it's introducing a new compound, or it is removing whatever is maladaptive in the body. And in this case, you're actually playing upon natural mechanisms in the body to actually cause it to almost correct those problems on its own.
Interesting.
And same thing with stem cell, of course. You'd be looking at mechanisms that would allow your body to almost jumpstart back into a more infant state, and that it can actually address and actually rebuild tissues that normally it just wouldn't do on its own.
So what kind of ailments or diseases, or what are you treating, I guess?
Joint pain, low back pain is obviously a really big one. Essentially everything that you can possibly think of that would ail an older person is things that we'll treat on a daily basis.
Okay, cool. And that's kind of that's just your current means of income, correct?
Yeah, and so with that, we've really utilized that to invest in a home as opposed to rent. I really like the idea of being more mobile, just being more autonomous in what I'm doing. And with an apartment or even a larger scale tiny house, it's just not something that you can really do. I mean, it's difficult driving 60 miles with a tiny house of the proportions that we oftentimes see on YouTube or whatever the case may be.
Right.
So with a fiberglass trailer like what we went with, in a large part as a result of watching Baron and Elsa's videos, I think that it kind of reaches a happy medium of portability and also just being able to improve it and make it ours, where oftentimes you can't do that. And it was affordable enough and a good investment that it was a worthwhile thing to do. It wasn't taking a back step like rent would have been. It's advancing in the future with an investment and with a place to live while we're doing whatever we're doing now.
So maybe let's dive into the camper. So tell us about what's her name or his name?
It's Pi. So it'd be like the Greek letter pi.
Back up just a second.
And so we got it off of a sticker on the camper, so it's not really too fancy, but it's a really cool value, and math is pretty cool, so I like pi. But it's a 1985 U-Haul CT13. And so they were originally made by U-Haul to be like rented out essentially like for a weekend camping trip. And it didn't really go in favor of U-Haul, I guess.
Like they weren't making enough
Yeah,
money off of them.
and so they eventually sold them off into the public in 1992, I believe. I mean, you can go on to all the forums. All those guys know U-Haul campers much better than I do. But from what I was able to glean from them, they weren't successful, but they were built much sturdier than a lot of the fiberglass campers, just because of the wear and tear they kind of expected to have them put through with all the people actually renting them.
And they're a little bit bigger even than the Scamp.
Yeah, it's kind of strange seeing like another fiberglass trailer with respect to ours. I think it's taller, but the internal dimensions are just strange.
They're different, yeah. Like their closet, for example, reaches out further into the main living area, and it's a little bit more narrow, and the ceiling is far taller.
Yeah, I can stand up in it.
Yeah, and you're 6'2", 6'3", maybe?
Yeah, I don't know.
Somewhere in there. Taller than I am. So that's super cool. And then the bumper is really like reinforced and seems bomb-proof.
Yeah, it's got an aluminum bumper on the back so you don't back into something. Or if you do, it's not going to destroy the fiberglass. Yeah, it's really strange, all the differences in it. It's been a really fun thing to work on.
Do you mind saying what you paid for it?
It was like $9,000.
Okay.
Which is a little bit more than what we were really wanting to go with to begin with. Probably in a large part just because, like, I mean, seeing what you guys paid for yours, we were kind of like, whoa, like, we're kind of overstepping what the value of these actually are.
But when you're buying a house for under 10 grand, it's pretty logical even still, right?
Yeah, what really got me to actually just kind of finally just say we're going to buy it is looking back at all the money we'd spent in rent looking for a trailer was equivalent to the cost of the trailer in and of itself. Yeah. So like we were so concerned to like invest in something to live in when the thing that we'd been investing in, if you will, for the last, year was more than that, and we weren't going to get any return on it.
Right, so you're shopping around trying to get the best deal, and then doing that each month that you spend.
It's getting more and more expensive.
Right, that's an interesting thought. So then where did you find it, and where did you have to look, and how was like the tracking one down? What was that like?
Tough. I think that the biggest thing was we were really looking at greater distances than probably we should have been doing to begin with.
As far as in proximity to where you live?
Yeah, so like, like Washington and Oregon, we were looking at a lot of Craigslist ads over there, and we wouldn't have even been able to plan a trip out there in the time that would have been required to get it. I mean, as soon as they became available, they'd be, gone in a couple days, and most definitely within a week if it was a worthwhile trailer. And so we started looking more in Montana, and interestingly enough, the one that we ended up buying, we kind of put off for a while. Like, we kind of thought it was kind of silly. Like, it seemed like...
Just because it was a U-Haul?
Like, what the heck's a U-Haul trailer? Like, these people must not know what they're talking about. And then I started really looking at it and doing some research. And that in conjunction with the durability of them and the rarity of the trailer, that really bought me as well. I mean, I think there was 1,750 of them made of the 13-foot trailers.
Wow.
And so to me, like, my dad's really big into like investing in like artwork or like money or like limited runs of things. And so it made sense to me to also do that with the trailer. I mean, if you could do something that wasn't just mass produced, and how many of those trailers are even surviving now? So you're really looking at something that's so finite that, and for whatever reason, people love finite things. So that seemed to be a good investment and a good selling point.
So it'll almost definitely increase in value over time.
Yeah, I would think so. I've heard talk of them actually like doing something like what Airstream has done, where you have like an Airstream club. They've kind of talked about like taking all the U-Hauls that are present now, and kind of keeping track of them better, longitudinally speaking, to see, which ones are even alive, and also see like who has them and where they're at.
That's cool.
Which I think would be super cool. I mean, like you see a big number plastered on the back of pie, and it like has like a, almost like a weird serial number that's beyond the U-Haul aspect and more of a community aspect for people who are utilizing them for different purposes now. So they really tell a huge story. I mean, it's crazy to think that, our house has already lived several lives and it's just now jumping into like a new future.
Right.
I'm super stoked about it, yeah.
So, when you got the camper, what kind of shape was it in, and what kind of work have you done thus far?
So, part of it was hard to tell. Like, around here, we have a lot of problems with rust.
And around here is, where are we in Montana, generally speaking?
Yeah, so northern Montana, northwest Montana. So, a lot of the roads around here, they use a lot of, like, sodium chloride. And so it just completely destroys vehicle frames around here. And so first thing I was really attentive on was looking and making sure we didn't have a bunch of rust damage.
On the frame.
Right. And so like first thing I did was I was crawling underneath it and making sure we were okay on that respect. It was very well put together in that there were compartments designed for all the holes they had cut. And so they had like little U-Haul inserts for like the area above the kitchen, like dinette, I think that's what they call them. And so you had to actually like unscrew those to even get into access the full space that you actually had.
Interesting.
And so in a large respect, we ended up losing a lot of our ability to really visualize what we were buying because of the fact that it was so well put together.
So you couldn't really get at the skeleton of it.
Right. And the other thing that U-Haul did that was really interesting is that U-Haul campers are actually like I've heard the marine community kind of say it's not true, but they're almost like a double hull or a double wall structure. So I guess it's not the same as like how boats are actually put together.
Because you probably couldn't dip it in the water and have it hold water between the two holes, right?
To be honest, I wouldn't want to really try.
Right. But
we haven't tried that yet.
But it's like an external fiberglass layer, and then you have like an internal fiberglass facade within that, right?
Right. And so that's, yeah. And so we've got the inner layer, and it goes up into like a seam on the top. And so these U-Haul campers are very similar to how like the burrows are put together, where they have that center seam where they take two of these molded pieces, fit them together. But in this one, they covered that center seam with carpet, which I don't know who was responsible for that idea. I'd love to talk to them about that too.
And this is opposed to like in the Scamps build, it's clamshelled the top onto the bottom portion. Mm-hmm. So there's a seam going across the middle. So we have that metal flashing across the middle line of the Scamp horizontally. On the U-Haul, it's split directly in half on like what would that be, like a vertical?
Sagittal.
Okay, sagittal, of course. So the line splits from like the tongue of the trailer up across to the tail, rather than going all the way around.
And so, in a large part, they hid an old damage to the external fiberglass shell by having that carpet on the inside. And so, the best that I can come up with is that a tree or something fell on it at one point in time, which really, honestly, is not a problem. And structurally speaking, like it was repaired. I'm just kind of extremely particular with that type of thing, and I really like to know, like, what is the state of the overall trailer? Like, how is it put together? Is it rigid? Do I have to be concerned about certain regions of it? And so, like, as we started pulling down the carpet, one of the older repairs we realized hadn't been fiberglassed appropriately. And so I learned how to fiberglass real quick. And we did a few repairs on that. There was a hole cut out on the driver's side, and they had to put a fan underneath the kitchen dinette. I don't know why. And so what we did was we actually we removed all of like the sink and everything underneath the dinette, and we were able to get into the back side of the piece of metal that had been riveted to the fiberglass, and we wiped it down with isopropyl alcohol, and then we were able to fiberglass on top of that piece of metal. And so by doing that, we're essentially getting an external backing that mirrors that of the external border of the fiberglass, and we're filling the hole at the same time. And then what we did was we went back through and we drilled out all the rivets and pulled that piece of metal off. And so that gave us a cover that I believe it to be stronger than the actual structure of the fiberglass. Fiberglass for these trailers is actually put in with like mat. And so you can also use like a cloth. It's like a fabric. It's like an interwoven fiberglass material, and it's way more structural. It has more rigidity with that respect. And so we put a little bit of that on there as well, since we had, we bridged such a large gap.
Right.
I felt it necessary that we made it stronger than maybe how you would have repaired it. And there's kind of, I don't know, there's perspectives as to how you should go about doing that, but
It seems bomber though.
yeah.
And it looks good. I think once you guys sand it down and match the paint, it'll be excellent.
Yeah, I love being able to actually like learn how to do things. I mean, if anything, like my college education has taught me that, just to be able to be, be optimistic in what you're able to actually address. Like, you can solve way more than you really think you can if you just trust in yourself enough to just try, just dabble in it just a little bit.
I think that's such an important lesson.
Yeah, and it's terrifying. I mean, like buying a camper trailer like this and saying that you're going to live in it, and then now you got a big hole that you just ground through it, and you've never fiberglassed before in your life. Like, you kind of reach a point where you're like, maybe I should just like return this. Like, does this dude have like a return policy on this?
Yeah.
But in reality, I think that, being able to start in like these little projects and kind of work your way up into the confidence that you can start tackling things that are more meaningful at a larger scale. And that's kind of what we've been, I've definitely done it before with different projects, but this has really been like, I'd say probably like my first like really large scale
Totally.
approach at really learning something that is very, very necessary that I learn how to do quickly and do well.
So, and then you had an AC unit on top. So you fiberglass. So initially, though, if I understand correctly from your warning labels that are still attached inside the pie, there was a swamp cooler, which is that's kind of the same mechanism that we use to cool down our cooler with like a evaporative cooling.
Yeah.
But do you know how that worked or what the idea was there?
Yeah. So, to my knowledge, there was a water pump that was in the rear driver's side compartment underneath the bed, and so that pump would pump water from, I don't know where the reservoir actually was, but they would have had to have a water reservoir, and it would just pump it up into that swamp cooler, and obviously you'd have that evaporative cooling effect. There was a dial on the closet just as you walked into the door on the left. Like, there's instructions how to run the whole entire thing from that. Non-functioning now, of course.
That's a really cool idea. But the only thing with swamp coolers is they're most effective in arid climates, and if it's humid, they're not super effective, right?
Right. You need to have a very dry heat in order to have the most cooling effect, essentially.
Right. So you live in the camper with your partner, Aaron, and how has that been? Like, have you guys enjoyed living together in such a small space? Is that something that is a struggle? Do you have any advice there?
To be honest, I wouldn't say that it's been difficult at all. It's definitely different getting used to having less available. I think that's probably the biggest thing. You don't realize the degree of consumption and how, I don't know, you just kind of use whatever is available. And so, as you start removing yourself from those resources, you just kind of change how you utilize them, I guess. Our fishing trip, like, you didn't have an endless quantity of food, so you didn't maybe eat like you would have been if you had it. Like,
I was scavenging for ants and pieces of mint.
Yeah, there were 4 ants involved for sure. 4 ants lost their life on that fishing trip, absolutely.
That's awesome. So what resources from like normal life, like living in an apartment or whatever, what were the things that were the most visceral or the most like hard to adapt or the hardest to adapt to?
I think cooking has definitely been a lot different. Cooking where you have like an endless supply of water is definitely something that you take more advantage of than you realize.
Even for just cleaning and stuff.
Yeah,
huh?
you use so much water, and it's really hard to gauge how much you use. I mean, we've gotten it down to using 7 gallons of water a week. That's not including showers. We actually have like a gym membership that will go shower. But we only shower a couple times a week. I mean, beyond that, I think it's kind of excessive. I mean, nobody really complains that we're, at least not to my face, I don't know. So I think that water was definitely a difficult thing to get used to. And more than anything, I think like with respect to the dishes, like it's really difficult to like cook meals that you're not going to be like cleaning up the dishes for an extended period of time.
That's part of the beauty of having a dog. You know, at most things with camp, we can clean it up most of the way, and then he'll polish them off.
Yeah,
You know?
the mice help a little bit with that,
Oh, dude, that's
but
gnarly.
not to the degree that you think.
That's horrible. So running water is an issue, and you guys, like us, cook outside 100% of the time, or?
Yeah, to this point we have. I think that we'll probably be cooking inside a little bit more as soon as we get our vent fan put in. We kind of skipped over that. So I believe that's where the swamp cooler originally was on the trailer. It had been replaced with the AC unit. And so we took that AC unit down because we're not going to have access to that type of electricity when we're in the middle of nowhere. And so we're kind of shifting into more DC powered and very efficient electronics. But by getting that out and putting a vent fan in, we'll be able to utilize that vent fan to exhaust a lot of the vapor that'll be produced with cooking. And that, in addition to the windows, especially as it starts getting colder in Montana, I think is going to be probably the new norm, which is kind of, we don't really know exactly how that's going to go.
And you'll probably have to adapt your diet to that type of cooking too.
Yeah.
Like you won't be able to cook like exquisite curries all the time just because they'll stink up all of your things.
Right. I mean, I think
unless that's just not something you care about.
Yeah, I don't really care too much. One of the things though is that like we're getting a refrigerator. They're back ordered now, which is kind of unfortunate, but
and go into that quickly if you don't mind. Like the brand that you were looking at, you were saying ARBs are made by Nomadic, and Nomadic there was some issue there, or?
Yeah, essentially the quality control seems to be kind of a problem from a lot of the reviews that I was able to find. I've had good luck with angle coolers, and the angle
NGLE.
Yeah, and the angle refrigerators have quite a following, and they seem to be very durable. They all have a pretty good warranty, so we'll see what comes with that. But
and is it open from the top? Or?
Yeah, it opens from the top, and it opens like lengthwise. So you would just we actually have it set up now where underneath the kitchen portion we have a box that's going to fit that refrigerator perfectly, and we have like drawer slides that'll actually slide out. They've got like 100-pound capacity drawer slide, and so essentially we can just slide our refrigerator out, open it up, take whatever we need, close it, and slide it back. And we'll have a locking mechanism on it as well, so we don't send it through the other side of the camper when we're driving some gravel road in the middle of nowhere. And I think that will probably really change how we end up eating in the wintertime, in that before what we would do is, every weekend we just cook a bunch of like beans or lentils or rice, and then we just kind of dip into that bulk food that was already cooked for our meals. And I think really that's probably the most genius way to really cook, because you're eating good food and you're kind of supplementing onto that.
Yeah.
It's really, eating good food is a very difficult thing to really do, and I think it becomes extremely difficult when you don't have the modern luxuries of a kitchen.
Totally. And refrigeration.
Right.
And how we do it is we're going to town like a couple times a week or whatever it is, and getting fresh food, and then we just keep it in the cooler and cool it with swamp cooling technology effect. Just a towel and a little
Which,
USB
interestingly
fan.
enough, has been lost before.
Yeah.
We lost it. We forgot evaporative cooling in Africa, and it was just retaught back to the people, like, relatively recently.
Huh. I didn't know that. So what was the technology like eons ago or whatever it was?
So ceramics. I mean, ceramics is a huge invention. I mean, every culture really utilized them, at least to my knowledge. And so what they would do is they'd take like an inner pot that had an enamel, so like a glaze on the outside of it, and then they'd take an even bigger pot from that, and they'd set the smaller one inside and fill in between those two pots with sand. And then they'd pour water in that sand and cover it up. And so that evaporative cooling would keep all the water out of the inner pot, so you weren't introducing water into your food, but it was cooling it.
So the inner pot holds your food then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting.
And so there was a guy that actually taught that back to the people, and it made it an affordable technology so that, instead of going to a market where nobody has refrigeration for their vegetables to sell, now you've got people who have access to ceramics and the technology. I mean, it's always the intricacy being, how to use things, and he's taught that back to them so they can refrigerate freely. And it's such a good environment for evaporative cooling that...
Given its arid nature.
Yeah.
Wow, that's wild. So yeah, we're using an ancient evaporative technology to keep our stuff cold.
It's really quite interesting looking at most of the things that we have. I mean, most of the solutions to the most complex problems that we have are very old technologies that are extremely simple. I think we just think that they're too simple to be the answer to the problems we have.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's brilliant, and that's kind of a virtue that I try to live by. Like try to find this. If you have a complex problem or any kind of problem, try to find the simplest solution.
It's probably your head that made it more complex.
Right,
really.
Right. And then we tend to hide in the complexity of the problem. So rather than getting at a simple solution, we tack on all the reasons as to why we can't do it or why it is too complex to solve, rather than just getting at the very fundamentals of it and solving it at a...
Yeah, or who's responsible for the problem.
Yeah.
That's a big one. That's too deep.
Yeah. All right, let's zoom back out. We'll get metaphysical here in a minute. So we're talking about the cooler and so I guess the types of foods that you guys eat. So currently in your current setup, you have a piece of land just outside of town that you've been staying on, and you're just using a cooler right now, right?
Oh yeah, we've got it dialed. So there's a refrigerator with a freezer at work, and so what we'll do is every day we go to work, we'll just bring a couple bottles of water, throw them in the freezer, and when we're done with work, we take our bottles that are frozen at that point, take them back to our cooler, and then we'll just recycle that. And so, I think we have 4 bottles total, or we did. That's another story. So we'll just take those 2 bottles and just cycle them. And so we haven't had really any problems with our food spoiling or anything like that.
Because buying ice is... honestly, it gets expensive, one, and then you just have all this plastic, and you're dealing with the melting ice. So if you have the water bottles, then you don't deal with any of that.
So that's actually another ancient technology that we discovered last summer. So, with our fishing, so we haven't, this is obviously a new venture for us. Last summer, though, we did a lot of fishing out of the back of the truck. And so, half of the summer we spent...
Not actually fishing out of the back of the truck, but you're camping in the truck.
It depended upon the hole that we were actually fishing out of, but yes, what Barron said. But we spent half the summer living in the back of the truck, and so that really taught us a lot of the skills, and probably, you talk a lot about, your mental capacity to deal with things, being okay with having less luxury is probably the biggest step, and I think a lot of people are really afraid to address that because they just don't know any different.
Right.
And they think that they'll be, what is it? Yvonne Chouinard has a beautiful quote on that. Like an impoverished life. What is it? What was it go?
It's not coming to me. I know where you're going, but it's not coming to me.
Yeah. But essentially, you don't have to live an impoverished life with less. You can have less and you can live to a greater scale than most people could even imagine living at.
Because when you give up those sort of opulent luxuries, then you unlock different pathways that are really more luxurious than those luxuries were.
Totally.
So like we gave up running water, but in trade we travel as much as we want all the time, you know? So like those types of things. Like it sucks to, yeah, like digging a hole and pooping in it is a thing, you know? But to be able to be in the mountains all the time or travel around or all these different like adjacent possibles that are unlocked by those sacrifices are often overlooked.
And then looking at it from another perspective, I mean, we look at it as far as like, you know, something you have to give up, but I think it's also a really good learning opportunity. I mean, realizing where your running water comes from, learning where your refrigeration comes from, like where does your electricity come from? Like, so many people don't even think about those types of questions, and in reality, in large part, that's why we're suffering the consequences that we are with that.
Right, because everything's abstracted away.
Yeah, I mean, like our food system, like, where is this food coming from? Who's producing it? Who's in charge? Who's the seed companies? Who's the chemical companies? And you really start to kind of discover things that maybe you wish that you'd never even known.
Yeah. Like, I think something that was made visceral too is dealing with waste and trash.
Yeah.
And recycling and compost and all these different things. Like, we started composting stuff or like burying compostable things.
Oh.
Just to like limit our waste production. And then recycling becomes a definite habit because you can only deal with so much trash at like a grocery store trash can or, you know, like a gas station trash can receptacle is only so big, you know, so then you're recycling a lot more. So then we try to buy things that don't produce as much waste so that we don't have to deal with that waste. And in doing so, it's like we see all of the waste that we were producing in the past, and it's alarming, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really crazy. Like, we don't produce that much waste, but like every time we have to go throw trash away, like we're so disappointed in ourselves that like we actually utilize that many like single-use plastics just to eat.
Right, yeah, I think you and Aaron and Elsa and I are both doing our best to not be like wasteful, but in our culture, it's honestly difficult, and I hate to use that excuse, but it's hard. Like now in Montana, I've noticed that there are a lot more bulk food stores, and that's been a really cool thing.
Yeah. The other thing that we just saw today is like the local recycling place, they don't even accept cardboard anymore.
Really? I know they don't accept glass out here.
Yeah, we don't have glass, we don't have plastic. The only thing we have is paper, cardboard, aluminum cans, and other essentially mixed metals.
Maybe there's an opportunity there.
But just recently, like we just dropped stuff off, and they said that they're going to have to start charging to take cardboard.
Interesting.
And so you kind of start reaching a point where maybe this is a more sound solution to the waste that we're producing, and that you have to be more conscious of it. But fundamentally, that problem, I think, almost lies more at the hands of the stream that the consumers are actually like feeding out of.
Totally.
And so,
well, it's kind of an excuse that I don't want to use, but we're at the end of that sort of tributary,
right?
You know, so it's like but we can also choose and like influence the patterns with our buying habits more so than we realize, you know.
And so that's kind of what has started us on another avenue, being that we've been working on a piece of property that we have access to for essentially growing food and selecting food that is very tolerant to cold temperatures, a short growing season, something that you could plant in another location at a lower elevation, and it would do extremely well, and it would deal with early frosts. It would deal with huge fluctuations in temperature. And our intentions with that is eventually kind of go the direction of like Rob Greenfield. I think he's a pretty cool guy. I mean, I definitely recommend that you go watch some of his videos.
Is he the one that does the terrace farming?
No, that's Sepp Holzer.
Okay.
Yeah, he's in northern Northern Austria is where he's at.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about Rob Greenfield.
Oh, geez, I don't know. he could tell you about himself better than I could, I think. But he's doing, his most recent project is he's been living off of only food that he forages or grows for the last, 200 and some days. He's going to do it for a year. And so he has multiple different gardens where he's at in Florida where he'll actually go and harvest his food, and he's kind of got like work shares, if you will. Like he'll ask him if he can turn their front yard into a garden in exchange for him building a shed on their property and living on it. And so by doing that type of a model, he's producing his own food. He's not over-consuming with respect to the amenities that he demands in order to survive. And it's a very provocative example of how you can live.
Yeah.
I mean, it really forces you to kind of, I don't know, re-examine how you're living, and if this guy can just move around from town to town and do this and be totally okay. I think he said that he doesn't want to make more than $5,000 a year.
Interesting. I think there's so much virtue in that. That's been sort of, because I for a long time chased making more and more money to solve my problems, but it's a fool's game, it seems. There are ways to win that game. Honestly, there are plenty of ways to win that game. But at the same time, I think it's a lot less input to figure out how to be more frugal and how to be more effective with your spending and how to buy things with the highest value than it is to find ways to make more and more and more money. Because I think inevitably you keep spending out of control.
Yeah.
So I'm with Rob on this one.
It makes you really question yourself more. I think it kind of puts it back on yourself as opposed to letting extraneous goods define you more than how you actually present yourself and how you go about your life.
Totally.
So I think it's a very interesting yet very difficult thing to go about doing.
Yeah. Especially societally, because there's a lot of judgment, because our sort of scorekeeping mechanism culturally is your yearly income. So I got a high score this year, but I'm trying to get a low score and figure out how to work with a low score as best as possible.
I like fishing more.
Yeah, I like fishing.
Days on the water.
yeah, that's a good measure of success, days on the water. Okay, so you have your farm. You're growing as...
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
So you're trying to target species of plants that are that grow really well at relatively high altitude, cold temperatures, which is where what is the altitude up here where the farm is?
I think it's only 4,500.
Okay,
so
but it gets cold.
Yeah, we got our first freeze. What would have been July 19th.
Are you serious?
Yeah, so a lot of our crops already died. But that's okay, that's okay. So
because that's a forced selecting function, right?
Yeah, so essentially, probably we'd be considered to be very, very bad gardeners and farmers. But that's okay. So the way I'm looking at it is that if we take a crop that doesn't do very well here, you're going to have multiple different genetics within that crop that have the capacity to deal with it. It's almost just chance. You're just pulling it out, seeing who has the capacity to do well under this certain scenario,
or just survive,
right? Or who produces flowers first. So, for example, one of the crops we've been playing with is fava beans. Fava beans do very well in a lot of places, but here, we just started getting our fava beans to flower couple of weeks ago, and so what we're doing is
it's currently, it just turned August. It's the 1st of August.
Yeah, so I think so.
A couple weeks ago, mid-July.
Yeah, that's about right. And so what we've been doing is kind of keeping track on what fava bean plants flowered first, and we'll save seed from those plants and propagate it first. And so essentially we're just trying to take the best genetics, the most efficacy that we can out of whatever plant is willing to display it and propagate it. And that, in conjunction with the epigenetics of the plant, actually looking at what plants really learned how to survive and understood that they needed to change, turned off or turned on certain genes in order for them to be more effective in this climate. And so another one that we tried, which I'm not entirely sure what is going to happen this year, but that's totally okay. I love experimenting with this. We tried 3 different varieties of rice. We did 2 from northern Japan and 1 from Ukraine. And so we planted those early on, and a few of them died, but one of them persisted even though the rest of them died. And so I was super stoked about that. Aaron's like, oh, our rice crop failed.
But you're like, we got a strong one.
Right. I'm so excited that some of them survived. And I don't know if they'll end up producing or not, but we still have all of August, and they're still alive, and so we'll see.
So why rice?
I think rice is an extremely interesting crop. I think the stats I looked at it, they were like, they produced a staple crop for like 1/3 of the world's population. And furthermore, a lot of these mountainous areas, we have problems with flooding in the spring. Why not take advantage of a characteristic in rice in that it enjoys being in water, and it actually acts as a weed pressure against other plants, in addition to the fact that water also has a very high specific heat. So as soon as it is warmed, you can deal with very cold nights in the spring and get a crop earlier than you might have been able to do in another scenario, given the fact that the soil would have been too cold. And so I think it could be a really easy crop to grow given the proper genetic work on the crop. It's just kind of a guessing game. I mean, you don't really know what will do well and what won't, but I think that's why I enjoy it so much. You don't really know what you're going to find.
So what plants have worked well, or what different crops have worked well for you thus far?
The fava beans have done extremely well.
The kale was doing well when we went up there.
Yeah, that should be fine. I wasn't really too concerned about that.
It was delicious, though.
Yeah.
I about cleaned you guys out.
Yeah. He was hungry. We didn't have any ants at that time. What else? I think we'll probably start shifting more and more into some grain crops as well. I've been really inspired looking at the Land Institute in Kansas. They are developing perennial crops, which I think is absolutely the answer to a lot of the problems we're experiencing. I mean, you look at the diesel expenditure, how much we're actually using in diesel in order to just prepare a field. And then with a perennial crop like Kernza, you go through and you harvest it once a year, or you co-plant it with another crop that you can harvest and is also a nitrogen-fixing crop. You're kind of doing 2 things at once, which is a skill, at least in this lifestyle, that you kind of learn to really lean into.
Yeah.
Like, it's pretty important to do, and especially with like a limiting resource like, fossil fuels. I mean, if we have the capacity to do the amount of, have the amount of energy that we can have with these fossil fuels, we really need to improve the yield from each gallon spent, if you will. Right. We need to make it mean more.
So the idea with perennial crops is you plant them once.
Yeah.
And then you don't have to deal with planting them and preparing the soil again and cutting and removing the dead plants and all these different things.
Right, totally.
So you plant them, they establish themselves, and year after year they even get stronger.
And interestingly enough, they're also what they would define as like a regenerative agricultural technique, in that every time you cut it back, you have a bunch of root die-off. And that root die-off is carbon that's being sequestered within the soil. And so every time you're able to do that, you're taking carbon that would be atmospheric and turning it into a carbon-rich soil, which is something that we need to do in order to actually turn around this consumption habit that we have. We consume everything out of soil and think that we can just like throw in, our basic fertilizers and it will solve the problem. But you look at how much a little bit of carbon will do in the hydration of the soil, like the overall ability of that water to be absorbed by the soil. I mean, you look at different techniques, like one of them's a Ruth Stout method of like farming or gardening. She lays hay over top of her garden, and so that acts as a mulch, a barrier that also absorbs water. And so as you start looking at mimicking the mechanisms that nature utilizes in order to sustain its persistent nature, you learn that really, once again, all of the solutions that we really need are already being displayed by us. It's just that we're too busy, looking around for ants as opposed to realizing that we just figured out how to not irrigate our crops as much, how to build more carbon within our soil, and essentially do more things that we want to do and less things that demand this, high attention, this high input that we have become so addicted to doing with pretty much everything.
So with Kernza specifically, that's a perennial crop that they're working on in Kansas, which, yay, Kansas. It's not often that we get to cheer for our state. So Patagonia is using Kernza in their beer, right?
Right,
So
long root ale.
So Patagonia started making both food, and the company that makes clothes started making food and now beer.
Patagonia Provisions is that branch.
And they've pivoted to make their mission statement to save the world, effectively, right? Yeah,
and so if you look at it, if you buy, like, how long does a jacket last you? You might get 10 years out of it, 5 years, and then you got to buy a new one. And I guess Patagonia's perspective and Yvon Chouinard's perspective is that if you're having to consume at that rate, there's got to be a better way to address a lot of the problems that we're having. And he thought that food, you eat all the time. And so why not revolutionize how we're actually doing that, or really go back to how we were doing it and make it something that's more sustainable so that we didn't have as much of an impact or a maladaptive impact. Because I think there's a really important point here, and that is that people get so caught up in thinking that by being present, they're having a maladaptive impact. But in reality, we can improve things at a much greater rate than we even understand. Like our ability to agitate systems into becoming more productive is something that I don't think have really tapped into.
More productive in a regenerative way, too.
All right, so like permaculture, that's one of the things that I think is absolutely fascinating. And I think that permaculture really addresses most of the problems that we have extremely well.
So zoom out a little bit and define permaculture as best as you can.
Okay. So permaculture was originally coined by Bill Mollison. If you have a free moment, I would absolutely recommend that you go watch some of his videos. The dude's
give me some of the best ones and I'll put them in the show notes.
Okay, yeah, definitely. But essentially I think he was just really frustrated with how things were going in his research, or something academically speaking, and so he kind of went the other direction, and so he defined something that was very cyclical, if you will. So in nature, you can follow the course of, you can scale as far in or out as you please, but you can follow everything as it cycles around. The petroleum fuels that we're utilizing now are ancient deposits, hydrocarbons that have been there for an extremely long time that were once carbon dioxide, right? That carbon dioxide would have been turned into a sugar by a plant and then ingested by an animal that would have been decayed down into a very complex hydrocarbon that we now use to power our automobiles. Mm-hmm. And so, looking at a plant, you take a plant, it degrades, it captures so much carbon dioxide every year in the summer, and as it degrades, it also releases that carbon dioxide and methane. And so being able to track those elements, not just in the plant itself, but also in the practices utilized in order to actually cultivate food. And so the idea of permaculture is that it's like a permanent culture. And so as opposed to looking at a plant that's like an annual, which is actually really rare, most plants are very perennial by nature, and the annual crops are actually, or plants are ones that are actually almost rejuvenating the soil.
Right, because it's almost wasteful from a biological perspective to regenerate your roots and grow from a seed every year.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. And so by looking at it from a different perspective and looking at more perennial crops for food production, and ones that you don't have to put as much input into, That's essentially permaculture. But permaculture expands out even further and also looks at like how like people interact. And so it becomes this really like deep interaction that I am not even capable of really touching on. There's much better people than I in order to actually explain that, but it really...
So how will you leverage these ideas in the context of your cabin or your land, or how do you hope to?
That's a really difficult question, honestly. I mean, like, I think that I almost definitely use it to produce a lot of my own food, to develop plants that are more independent and are more hardy so that I don't need to take care of them, tend them as much. Eventually, though, I think it's something that needs to be shared so that people can understand that there are different ways of going about being a human and that you can actually like do good by being alive and doing what you do. It's so far removed in that if you really start thinking about all the different maladaptive things that you do and just to subsist here,
We're pretty parasitic.
it's horrible. And so I think it's really important to give people a little bit of hope in that, you know, you can really improve things.
Yeah.
And I think that really that idea, as soon as you realize that you can improve things, you can take it wherever you want. And furthermore, I don't know. I mean, well, I guess you're talking about like the regenerative energy, aren't you?
Oh, well, we can. Yeah,
Okay.
we can go there now. So
Okay.
do you want to?
Totally.
So you have a creek running past the farm,
Yeah,
right?
I do.
So then the question becomes, how can you leverage the potential energy in the flowing water, right? Or I guess it would be kinetic, but there's still potential to leverage it, right?
Yeah, you can change that potential. And if I can think correctly, let's see, you would be using, so like a hydraulic ram pump, you can actually use 2 one-way valves and a pressure chamber to take a high flow, low pressure water source and convert it into a high pressure, low flow. And so essentially you can take that force and pump water straight up a hill.
So it's like a higher voltage, effectively. If you were, yeah, okay, that's confusing. But if you're going to take the metaphor of energy, it would be like converting it to a higher voltage. But it's like if you have a big bucket of water that's flowing down, and then you constrict that to a straw, you're going to have a lower flow, but it's going to be higher pressure, right?
Right, yeah, I buy it. I'll go with that.
So that's what you're trying to do, though, right?
Right, well, yeah. I'll pump water up using that mechanism, the voltage mechanism. And then what I'll do is I'll use the then converted potential energy by changing its relation to the surface I can drop it down to, and run it through probably a Tesla turbine, but you could also use a Pelton wheel. I'm really interested in the Tesla turbine, mostly just because a lot of people don't really know about it, and I don't think that it's really been exploited as much as it can actually be.
So what does the Tesla turbine do?
So a Tesla turbine has 2 different inlets and 1 outport, essentially, so where it actually, the water will come through. And so it uses the edge effect, so it's almost taking like an adhesive effect of the water. And so you have, I don't really know the exact number of discs, we'll say like 5 discs or so, and they're all like stacked on top of one another in this container, but they have a spacer in between each one of them so that they're not touching. And so when that water gets pumped through, it spins around, centrifugally speaking, and it goes into the center port, and that's the exhaust port. But as it's going around, it's taking all of that surface area and all of those discs, and it's causing it to have that adhesive effect where it actually pulls it as it twists around.
Interesting. So it begins to spin.
Right, and so essentially you have a drive shaft in the same orientation as the exit of the water as it comes to the Tesla turbine. And so you would take that rotational energy in the Tesla turbine to use that to generate your electricity, And I kind of played around with the idea of a trompe, a TROMPE. I actually learned that technology from Bill Mollison, the founder of Permaculture. And essentially, it's like an ancient technology that has then been revitalized in mining camps. And that's how a lot of mining operations generated pneumatic power. And so you drop water through a pipe, and the distance that you drop it is correlated or is equivalent to the amount of pressure that you're able to produce. And so you drop it through a
It's
larger
almost acting
pipe.
like a piston.
Kind of. It's a really complex. It's very simple, but it's really complex to kind of wrap your head around like how it's actually doing what it's doing. But you just run it from a larger pipe to a smaller pipe, and you have vents where you do that. And it plays off of the Venturi effect, where you have, let's see if I can remember this right, you increase the velocity of whatever is flowing through the pipe in a smaller pipe, but you decrease the pressure. And so you create a vacuum by actually necking it down, and it draws all that air in, which then is continually pushed down to the bottom into a pressure chamber, and that's where your compressed air comes from. But the scale is very difficult to reach, and furthermore, the amount of the compressed air that you would actually need in order to do a lot of the things is, for example, like a car or...
So you're leveraging gravity, right? Like it's some distance that the water has to drop to generate the pressure.
Yeah, I think it's
so
like...
you'd have to have like a cliff or something almost.
Or in the case of these mining operations, you'd have the top of a mountain, or you could drop it down wherever you want. And so they just had like an ideal scenario for that particular technology. But I've really fixated on the idea of using like compressed air as a means of a battery, as opposed to using like our standard battery mechanism. And I think that it would be useful in a number of ways.
Like you could run pneumatic tools, you could have pneumatic locomotion of some sort.
Yeah, and also like in the summertime, like one of the side effects, if you will, of decompressing the air or allowing it to retain to its normal pressure, 1 atm, what you would be doing is also cooling the air. But a really interesting thing is that by utilizing that air to do whatever you want it to do, for example, like what you said, a pneumatic tool, or to run a Tesla turbine, or whatever you wanted to use it for, you aren't releasing any like products of combustion. All you're doing is you're taking an inert substance and changing the pressure, which is really quite an interesting thing to think about. So you're building something in your cabin or your shop, and you're using pneumatic tools to do so. You're cooling it at the same time,
Right.
and so essentially you take
heating it if you're doing the inverse, right?
Right. And so I've kind of, I don't know, I'm probably persistent enough that I'll probably try doing something with a compressed air, with a trompe, in that if you drop it like 30 yards or so, you'll be getting close to like 40-ish PSI, which isn't a ton, but I think that I could drop it that distance. And really, like, compressed air is an extremely potent energy source. And so, like, with 40 PSI, you can do quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you won't run a vehicle, but you could definitely use it to generate passive electricity, or you could use it to... Oh, geez, I mean, you could use it to... operate very, very simple mechanisms that don't really require maybe as much torque.
And you could run a generator off of it, right? Like some sort of generator to generate electric energy that you could then use.
Right, you would use like an electromagnetic generator, so like an alternator. And so that's probably how you would be generating your electricity to begin with the that's how you'd be generating your electricity with a Tesla turbine, by dropping the water through it. And then what you would do is you would take that electricity that you were producing, and as opposed to running into a battery bank, you'd run it into an air compressor. And then once again, you could couple functions in that if you were doing more of your air compression at night, or you were doing more of it in the spring and the fall, you would be heating. And that there is going to be, it's an exothermic reaction essentially, and that you're going to be producing heat in the compression of the air.
So then you can take that extra heat and run it through your greenhouse or run it through your house or whatever you need.
Definitely. And so you can take what other people would look at as a disadvantage and leverage it to what you need in that particular scenario and kind of do two things at once.
So you're leveraging the entropy for like a further function. So then it's no longer entropy really.
Right. Yeah. And then the same thing with the decompression, with actually utilizing it. I mean, if it's really hot in the cabin during the summertime, you just, you are able to take that compressed air and maybe you're doing editing or you're using a bunch of electricity or you're running a refrigerator or something. By generating that electricity, you're just passively producing air conditioning. And so depending upon how you actually utilize those resources, you would be able to have a more comfortable existence while essentially doing the same thing that everyone else is doing, but going against the grain.
Why don't we use compressed air more as a energy source? Or an energy, like a potential energy storage, I guess, more than, I guess, it's both.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure why we don't use the compressed air. I know that we've kind of moved towards using like reservoirs as a potential energy source. For example, like if you have like a really sunny day in the summertime, right, and you are taking all of that sun, or at least if you're in Montana, a really sunny day in the summertime, we don't have those in the wintertime. So you take all of that electricity and you pump water with it. And you pump that water up into a reservoir, and then when you have like peak demand, high demand of electricity, you drop more water through your turbines in your dam, and you produce the electricity you need.
But then you have if you're storing it in a reservoir, then there's the water that evaporates out, so then you're effectively wasting a good bit of that energy use potentially, right?
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, you're also getting it there from somewhere passively. So
right.
I think that fundamentally it would be probably more intelligent to generate or produce that potential energy and utilize it only when you need it, as opposed to being wasteful in how we're generally doing it and just depending upon technology that's really not as advanced as it should be in order to actually retain it.
Okay.
And it'll better let us deal with the fluctuations and the requirements of electricity.
At scale, right?
Right, which is not what we're really doing with ours, of course.
But you can extrapolate the same principles out to scale pretty easily.
Right. The only problem with compressed air, though, is that you run into problems with, like, capacity for your storage. But I think that's where looking at something like a more modern air compressor, you're less limited by your environment in your ability to use a trump, and you can compress air at a higher PSI than you otherwise would be able to.
Okay.
And so and that's once again a really interesting thing to look at, like compressed air. Like if you take a vessel with so much compressed air and you take some of that compressed air out, what are you effectively doing?
Cooling
like you're changing the pressure within it, and you're decreasing your capacity to have energy in that vessel you just took from. You're always draining it out the bottom whenever you take it out. Right? But the interesting thing with the compressed air is that you also heat it, and it increases the compression.
Oh, interesting.
So you have that Brownian motion going for you, and that you just increase the movement, the fundamental movement of that, the constituents of that compressed air, to the point where you are increasing the pressure. And so you could take that compressed air container and put it in your greenhouse and use it in the heat of the sun, and you are amplifying the amount of energy you're able to, pull out of it passively.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that. That's wild.
I ran through a couple of the calculations on it, though, and I think that you'd have to get it relatively hot.
Well, but it is like a sizable difference between, like, I know this from playing paintball, and if we were storing our tanks inside and it was like nice and warm and you filled your tanks inside, then you take them outside and go play in the cold weather, and you have significantly less pressure in your tank. So it may not be like a huge difference, but it's a visceral difference at least,
Yeah. It depends on how you calculate it too. I was probably not using the correct equation. It would probably be the van der Waal equation.
Well, I wasn't
as opposed
using
to
an equation at all, but
the van der Waal equation would more accurately describe what was happening. The ideal gas law is.
Okay, so I think we've covered a good bit of leveraging pneumatics for energy. Are there any other interesting things that you'd like to dive into as far as the cabin goes, or do you want to pop back to trailer mode for a minute?
Trailer mode would probably be good.
Okay. Are there any, thus far, like in your experience in living in the camper, are there any clever solutions that you've leveraged or different ideas that have kind of been aha moments or anything like that? Or has it been mostly just like paring down and dialing in what gear you have and all that kind of stuff? And fixing the things that were already broken, or
Yeah, I mean, it's been a busy summer. Like when we haven't been working on it, we've been working to be able to fund it. So I don't know that we've really had any like really profound realizations as to how we should be doing things or why. But most definitely that what we're doing is the right thing to be doing. Like it definitely feels much better being able to be comfortable with less. And I think that, I don't know about you guys, but just being able to know that, like, you know, you hook up and you take your trailer down the road and like your existence is just like wherever you want to go.
Everything you need. So we drove together, like 60 miles outside of town. Mm-hmm. You said it was going to be like 25, 30, so that ended up being an interesting thing. But we were like 60 miles outside of town on a dirt road, and outside of cell service, like a good, almost 2 hours of driving with our campers especially. And being able to, both of us, be able to do that and drive out there and just have everything that we need was a pretty powerful experience.
Yeah,
you know?
Definitely. I mean, anybody who's ever felt like they left something behind, which is pretty much everyone, this is definitely a weird experience in that you're almost like reversing it and you're more concerned about what you brought along that you like shouldn't have brought along.
Right.
I mean, like, you just have everything. Like, you're not missing anything within your existence.
Elsa and I would always ask that when we first started. It's like, oh, do we have this?
Yeah.
You know? And it's like, oh, yeah, everything that we have is in this camp, so it's all good.
We did forget quite a bit.
Yeah, actually. We did, actually, at the cabin. Damn it. We were gonna, I want to learn how to tie flies, because that's something that we spent a lot of time doing, is fly fishing. And I think it'd be fascinating, and I think Elsa would be super good at tying flies, too. So I want to get into tying flies, but we forgot the vise. So we'll have to leave that for next time. Something that I have experienced in coming up to Montana and spending time like in the northern states, I've had plenty of experience, well, not plenty, but like some experience with black bears, but this is the first time that we've been around grizzlies. So what is that? Is that even something that you consider anymore, or is it just part of life? Is it like a subconscious thing? And in your interactions with grizzlies, like, what has that been like? Like, if you could kind of describe, because you've had several interactions with grizzly bears, so maybe just describe like what they're like as an animal and what it's like to interact with them.
Well, I mean, I'm definitely most of the time more concerned about meeting another person than a grizzly bear up there. The grizzly bears, generally speaking, are pretty chill. I mean, at least in my experiences that I've had. There's definitely some extraneous ones, but I think that a lot of those are more associated with either habituated bears or bears that just they were literally just scared.
Habituated meaning that they've come into contact with humans and got some sort of reward for it. Mm-hmm. So then they pattern that behavior.
Pavlov's dog.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so
they see humans and salivate. And it's not what we want.
Yeah, you don't want that at all. If you see a salivating bear, just I don't really know what to tell you, actually. Good luck. Yeah, I mean, like, I've had a few experiences, you know, walking down a road with holding a bike, and you come around the corner and there's a grizzly bear 40 yards in front of you, and it was my dad and I when we saw that bear, and we of course just kind of kept going along, following it, keeping our distance, and we followed that bear for several minutes. I mean, 10, 15, 20 minutes. And we just kind of gave it some room, and it was a pretty cool experience. It eventually came around this bend, though, and we kind of gave it some berth so we didn't get too close to it. And we came around the corner, and the bear was gone. So it was like a Bev Doolittle moment. So essentially, what I mean by that is, like, she'd do these paintings where there's a bear just like hidden within the picture that you don't see at first glance. And so we thought we'd come around the corner and there was going to be a grizzly bear that's just like hiding in the bushes just off to our right or left or somewhere, and it's just going to, be salivating at that point. And once again, like, that's not going to be good for us. But we kept walking a little bit further, and the bear had gone, I don't know, 15, 20 yards into this little wildflower meadow, and it was just hanging out in the meadow, just eating flowers. The strange thing, though, is my dad was like, this bear most definitely knew we were here, and it just didn't do anything. And so probably that's the scariest.
Like, it didn't even look back at you.
No, yeah, it never looked at us, never acknowledged us. And so that's probably the weirdest thing, is that we almost like expect some sort of like an acknowledgement, like something's happening. And we didn't get anything with that bear. But I mean, it just kind of continued on with what it was doing, and we did as well.
That's wild.
Yeah, I mean,
because you think, like, I guess, like, pop culture and everything paints grizzlies as being just like these ferocious sort of like voracious predators that they don't even have a thought or an interaction. It's just kill, kill, kill.
Right.
So I think it gives me a little bit of like sense of safety in knowing that it's another mammal, and it's looking to protect its own safety, and it's not gonna just jack with you for fun.
Right.
And they generally don't want to hunt humans because they've been selected to not. Like, the ones that do interact with humans are generally killed or moved,
Right.
So knowing all those things makes it a little bit more comfortable out here, but it's still an interesting sort of
it shouldn't be
background process to keep running.
I don't think it should be a fear. I think it's more of a responsibility, in that you and your actions are going to dictate what those bears learn. And so by being a responsible human and not, rewarding them and habituating a bear, you're really kind of changing the course for that bear's livelihood, like what they're going to do in order to survive. But
so, like, if we were to leave food out and a bear comes and eats the food, then the bear will likely come back to that camp over and over again. And once it does that, somebody will likely either kill the bear, or they'll have to, like, move it and tag it, and then that creates all this complexity for the bear.
Right.
So it's our responsibility to not be belligerent, because that could spare the bear's life even,
Right.
Right? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
It's more like being afraid of the dark, really. I mean, it's something that you don't know, you're unaware of, and so you fear it.
Yeah.
I mean, there definitely should be respect. Like, don't get me wrong, in that you should be respecting bears, because they have a capacity to, most definitely kill you or do, whatever they want to do. But I don't really see the fear component. I think that's almost like a rudimentary stage of kind of becoming comfortable just being outside. Really, I mean, like,
Yeah.
like there's a lot of scary things out here if you don't know what they are.
Right.
I mean, you could,
Like snakes, even, and even plants, mushrooms, all these things could be deadly.
you could be terrified of a squirrel if you didn't know it was a squirrel. Just depends. And sometimes it is a grizzly and you thought it was a squirrel, so who knows?
Earlier today, we're parked on a piece of your dad owns this land that we're parked on. And earlier today, I wasn't here. We weren't here. But a lady came by that lives in the area and was questioning what was going on, who owns this land, all those types of things. And we're talking about like that in the context of like society and how people look at sort of nomadic existence.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. I mean, it almost, I don't know, I didn't really know what to say to begin with. Like, I was kind of focused on just backing the trailer, and you know, these little fiberglass trailers, just, they don't back. They don't go back, they go forward. So I was backing it in, and my spotters weren't spotting, so I was more focused on that, making sure I didn't whack a cottonwood or something. And this lady pulls by, and so I was trying to get out of the road so she could pull through the road. And she was starting to question about, you know, what we were doing here, and essentially just like the validity of us existing here. And you know, I told her that it was fine. Like, my dad owned the property. It wasn't a big deal. It's not like we're just like parked on a random piece of property that somebody owned. And so it just kind of diverted into a conversation where then it was, you know, well, you need to be careful with, you know, fires. You know, this is a high fire danger, and people actually live here full time. And so, like, the best retort that I had was, you know, like, yeah, I live here full time too. I mean, like, this is my existence as well. Like, yeah, I don't really want to fire either. But it really
and
just...
we're not even, there's no fire, like, we're not burning any fires. All of our cooking has been done via propane. So it's like, it's a fear-based response. And she's trying to, like, have some sort of upper hand on you for choosing a different route.
Right.
Is kind of what it seems like.
And it becomes more of a thing just like attacking on like the existence being something that's different, unusual, and I don't know, it probably gets back to this whole class thing. I mean, you know, number one, we're parked down by the river, and that doesn't have a very good thing going for it. I think it's great, really. Yeah. Erin's a little sensitive on it. She doesn't like telling people we're parked down by the river. But just the fact that, like, we're living in a trailer, I think people automatically just kind of assume that we're just kind of low life, if you will.
Yeah.
Like, we didn't work hard enough, and we didn't, like, make it in this, you know, finance game, as Barron puts it, you know, like this encouragement for more and more and more, and like we just kind of dropped out of it. And so, yeah, it was just really interesting to think about, I guess, just kind of being in that position. I think it was the first time that we've really been put into a position where we're kind of like belittled for our lifestyle choice. And
it's an interesting thing, right?
Yeah.
Because like internally and like in my experience, like speaking, like I've had that sort of interaction plenty of times where it is belittling, sort of like people just looking at us like we're lower class than them, or like, well, we actually live here, or like we pay so much rent to be here, and it's like, well, I don't know how I can help you with that. You know, like, you could do this too,
right?
You know, but it's an interesting thing to deal with. And then from like an internal perspective, like everything's working, like it's great.
Yeah,
you know,
like,
so
no problems, no fires, even. Like, we're good.
I think part of the issue is, from her perspective, is it's probably uncomfortable to see what we're doing because it feels like we're hacking the system or something too.
But I experienced kind of a similar thing, like, and I really, like, that's one thing about living this lifestyle is, like, it really makes you start kind of diving into, like, depths of your mind that you normally don't, because you're so easily distracted by Netflix or Instagram or texting somebody or whatever. Like, you can find distractions that prevent you from really dwelling on things that maybe you kind of want to edge away from.
You kind of like lean into your subconscious naturally. You can't not.
And so one morning when I was walking this last week, I saw a bunch of the people with, like, you know, their dirt bikes and their side-by-sides. And it kind of makes you kind of question why you have, like, a intolerance of them. You know, like, they're like doing the same thing that you're doing, but you're just, like, almost, like, too scared to really, like, go talk to them and ask them, like, what they're doing. And you just kind of, like, harbor this perspective that isn't warranted. And I think that's probably a very similar issue with this whole scenario, in that it's a lady that's concerned about, you know, potentially it's her own preservation, really, whether it's financially speaking and the property value of her home, or in this case, the value of her home with respect to fire damage. But she's too afraid to really address it and like talk to us as people, and it becomes more as objects. And you guys just need to like don't do anything that's going to impact me.
Don't do what you're doing.
Just leave.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, I'd love to say that I don't feel that way towards people, but like most definitely, like I see people with like, dirt bikes or side by sides up where I'm camping, and like, don't be here. Like, you're here ruining a resource, and it's noise pollution. You are, wreaking havoc. Causing soil erosion, but it makes you kind of want to be a little bit more persistent in how you address it, and maybe get to the root of what's really going on, and if it's more centered in you or if it's centered in the actual activity they're doing. It really makes you kind of untangle that whole chaos and actually address something at a deeper level that you really don't want to do.
Which is pretty uncomfortable.
Right.
Or it can be. It's an interesting situation, and it's fun to read into it and kind of get a feel for what's going on there. But I think like where I've noticed it most, and even in interactions with rangers in different areas, is it's the places with the highest property values that people tend to be really uneasy about people camping there often. So it's not like the places that are not super opulent. You can normally, you could stay there forever, but it's the places where people paid a lot of money to get their house where it is that they really have an issue with people spending time there or camping there or what have you. Yeah. Which I understand,
But I mean, you see that around here. I mean, the property value has increased so significantly. It's like Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Like you guys were just through there. I mean, the billionaires have pushed the millionaires out, and it becomes a thing where like, in my experience, those types of people just kind of aim towards like seclusion. Like they just want to be by themselves. And so really, I think it's the same question, just redirected to another group of people. I mean, it's more of a fear-based thing, and what are they afraid of, and why are they...
What are they running from?
Right.
That's what I think is interesting. So, like, why is Jackson Hole this place for billionaires to retreat? Because it's up in the mountains, it's away from it all, so they can kind of like step back and maybe like lean into some of that introspection or escape away from the games that they're playing all the time. But I think it's interesting that you have to have a place to escape your life,
Right.
Like why that's maybe that needs to be addressed specifically more so than
Well, it's almost like a community thing in my perspective. I mean, we're so far removed from community, and myself included. I mean, like, we just don't really have the community that I think was around 100 years ago. I mean, you have a community with respect to, like, where you work, and you've got people that you spend your day with. But largely, it's something that is, removed when you go your separate ways. And I think that people really want a deeper connection with one another. It's just kind of an uncomfortable thing to do because you kind of have to open yourself up to other people.
Yeah. But then we have this sort of like human mycelial net that is the internet that has like it is a community on some level, but it's not visceral, So we crave that sort of visceral community. Yeah, as a species, I think. Like, I think it's human to want other people to be around, but then at the same time, we all seek solitude as well.
Right, and I guess probably that kind of enlightens my perspective in that's probably a large portion of why I'm interested in doing like the agricultural perspective as far as the farm and introducing viable crops. It's also that food is so closely related to like this social cohesion. Like food just brings people together, and what better way to bring people together than something that just allows them to persist? Because
it's necessary,
right? And so I think that there's multiple ways, but you look at our like food system now, and like you go to McDonald's and like you don't really have community at McDonald's, I guess. Maybe. I mean,
So
do
speaking,
you get McNuggets too? Like,
that's
I don't know.
I get a number 10 as well.
Oh
Excellent.
man, yeah.
But so thinking of it like culturally and from a community perspective, how have people in your life received what you're doing, and have you had to have sort of a jousting conversation as far as the decisions you've made in living in a camper and choosing this lifestyle and choosing to be relatively nomadic, or how have people received that?
Generally speaking, I've had no problems whatsoever.
Do you think that's partially to do with your ability to argue a point, or do people...
I am persistent, yes. I think the only person I haven't really like portrayed a lot of it to is my dad, but that's...
I feel like your dad would understand it the most, though.
Yeah, but there's dynamics that are too deep just to present a topic like that, I think. And it's kind of, what do they call it, like, agree to disagree?
Mm-hmm.
I hate that saying so much. All the sayings, I think I hate that one the most. But that's probably the one that I just kind of flow along with him. Just like, it's not worth the battle to introduce that.
So what does he not vibe with in it, or what's his... Or is it not that, or...
I won't have the monopoly money in the end.
Okay.
Like, it's totally just like a cultural thing. With respect to people, like questioning what I'm doing, I would say that most people have actually been extremely interested. And for what I do, like most of the patients that we end up having are older patients, and we hear it all the time that, they wish that they would have spent their lives doing something like more profound. And so to me, like anybody that says anything different, I mean, it's not equivalent in the value or the potency of somebody, an elderly person saying that they wish they would have done this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like Isaac and I were talking about this the other day. I mean, you think about, how did I put this with him? Like, you think about, like, being older and wishing that you would have done something different. Like, the value of saying something like that just becomes so much greater. There's so much more involved. Like, your very existence is, like, everybody's daily existence, or their existence is constantly just decreasing. And you've got somebody that's, like, so close to the end of, like, their, this mortality is actually, is going to take them, and they're having regrets in how they lived. Like that's just such a profound, I can't even imagine what that would feel like to actually say that. And like to understand that like the choices that you've made your whole entire life are ones that you wish that you hadn't have made.
So you think in doing this, then you can live truer to what you would retrospectively wish to have done?
Absolutely. On average, I would say that's exactly what's happening.
Because this allows you to spend more time in the wilderness, spend more time, or less time having to work to pay for just persisting.
I'm less of a tool utilized by a corporation or a business, and I'm more of an individual that's beginning to understand the repercussions of my existence. Yeah, I mean, that's a realization that I think everybody should have.
Yeah.
Like, you're not a tool, man. Like, you're a person too.
Yeah. Or you may be, but you don't have to be. It's not your purpose to be a tool.
Yeah, you can find better things to do than that.
That's excellent.
Use a tool, don't be a tool.
Yeah. Well, should we end it on that for now?
That sounds good.
And come back to the conversation at hopefully not too far into the future date. Are you and Aaron like will you be traveling soon, or are you gonna stick it out in Montana for a while, or what's the plan there?
No idea.
No idea.
Well, Erin called today. She still hasn't been like accepted as a resident for MSU. And so with that, I mean, we could, we'll probably like kind of persist in Montana mostly, just because she has to be in order to get like that residency, because she's going to have to petition again.
Okay.
And so they're very like rigorous as far as like how many days you've spent out of Montana. So like you can't be like a non-resident like trying to be a resident. So they have like, you know, quotas, right? You have to be here for so many days. But we'll probably try to go down to like the desert somewhere
Okay.
in the wintertime for as long as we can.
Cool. I got plenty of spots for you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to like learn, you know, the nuances of a different area.
Yeah, and because you have Montana dialed in.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's been fun, man. Like, I've learned more being around you and adventuring in the wilderness of Montana than I could have ever wished to.
Yeah.
You know, it's been.
I mean,
a blast.
it's kind of a hard thing in that like we're so like focused on like one thing. Like we've talked about like fly fishing so much that I kind of keyed in on that. But like in reality, I mean, like there's so many places that I know, like even in like the hot springs, like that's super cool. And I think that also like fly fishing is cool, but I still go back to that Thoreau quote. I mean, I like fishing, but I just like fishing because it gives me something to do when I decide that I want to have a fly rod in my hand. And then when I don't, then I'd rather, you know, I can find something else to do. It just kind of lends itself to almost like introspective thoughts or like just deep thinking.
Right, because you're like kinetically or like you're physically occupied.
Yeah.
In doing something, and you have something to think about, but it allows time for your subconscious to sort of chew on deeper problems.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, it's strange.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I have fishing has been something that I really enjoyed earlier in life. And it's wild too that we both spent a lot of time on the Lake of the Ozarks.
Yeah, that is really weird.
It's possible that we almost bumped John boats at some point.
I didn't bump your John boat. What are you talking about?
But it's so fishing for like largemouth bass primarily then and there, and targeting that species versus learning and with like spin casting and bait casting rods and all the equipment to go with it, and then learning like tenkara, which is almost the exact opposite of like bass fishing.
Yeah.
You know, it's been a really interesting like paradigm to wrap my head around.
Yeah, and it's super interesting looking at it. It's hard not to sound like elitist when you're talking about it with that respect, but you just kind of, it shows more vividly the progression of mindsets in like a human, and like how choices early on become more cognitively based and are formed and molded into something that is more representative of the human that's making those choices. And so I think that like with fishing, like you kind of get to a point where you're more keyed in on like maybe not really catching all the fish, but just kind of like getting in,
understanding
it's like
them.
what's going on,
and like finding your place in the wilderness, and figuring out like how different things are working, like what pattern of its life is the different fly in or the bug in that's hatching, and like how does that influence how the fish is interacting, and given like what point in the spawning pattern the fish is in, what part of the water are they holding in, and then if there's like different structure around, then where is the fish in relation to that structure.
It's almost just like practice in solving a complex problem. Really, like
and it's super iterative too, and it's like immediate feedback. You know, like you tie on a different fly, try, like you have a test for your experiment. It's like, okay, here's this, throw it in. Nope, experiment failed. Okay, what does that tell us given the data that we had before?
Yeah, and it's also really interesting looking at it with respect to like a foraging mentality. Like like the fact that we actually like kept some of the fish this trip,
which is something that neither of us often do.
That's like super novel for me.
Yeah.
And like I don't know, it's. I mean, you saw me go all Schmeagol, and like, I'm sure somebody's gonna see that.
Everybody in the video. That's part of it. Andrew having to go full golem on a fish that almost slipped out of his hands.
Yeah, you just kind of get rather primitive pretty quickly, huh?
But I think that's an interesting mechanism to like wake in our consciousness. You know?
Yeah, I mean, and the fact that like, you know, it's so easy. Aaron and we've been kind of talking about like doing something more with like foraging, like.
Yeah, I think living nomadically, it's the way.
Right. Well,
'Cause
I mean, like foraging is something that like obviously is like an intelligent thing to do, but then like being able to actually like present that and like show people like how easy it is to go collect your own food.
dude, I learned so much being around you guys and Aaron, especially with all the different plant identification and
Oh, yeah.
everything. Like when the last day that we were fishing, I brought a cigar to pass my appetite off, but I didn't bring any food. I just brought water, so I got kind of hungry, and I had been nibbling on chives, like wild chives, the days prior, but in this particular stretch of water, I couldn't find any wild chives. So I found some mint, some fireweed, which was interesting. Like the flowers weren't super, like they didn't have a ton of flavor, but the leaves kind of tasted like arugula almost.
Kind of spicy, yeah.
Yeah, and the mint really curbed my appetite, and we both ate a couple ants just to try it because I
Yeah.
can't say that I've ever done that.
They were mostly just crunchy, but
Yeah,
you gotta
I got a sour one. I got one sour one that was a little wild.
caught them on a bad day. I don't know.
No ramifications thus far. But then at camp finding the huckleberry field, and we picked like loads of huckleberries. And you guys even canned some while we were out there, which was pretty rad.
Yeah, once again, it's kind of one of those things we were talking about before where like I know how to can food. Like we've done like lacto fermentation, we've done other types of canning. I mean, you cook beans and throw them in a mason jar and you're essentially canning it, right? And so, yeah, just try something new. We've never done it before. We need huckleberries for, you know, a cold January day where we need some, you know, pancakes with some fresh huckleberries on it. And I don't know, it just kind of gives you more respect, I think, more than anything for like the native peoples.
Well, and respect for like how much like caloric intake we require.
Yeah.
You know, as modern humans,
Yeah.
if you were going to persist on huckleberries, you'd be picking huckleberries for a good chunk of your day.
Yeah.
You know, and then like fishing and catching a trout. And the interesting thing too is we couldn't legally, and I think just whether we could or not, like just understanding how their breeding patterns and everything work, I don't think that we would ever take a big fish, you know, given that they can procreate and the little ones are sort of they're not able to procreate yet.
Right.
But by law, you could only keep fish that were less than 12 inches. So we had to keep like a relatively small fish, and we harvested like 6 fish over the course of the.
Yeah.
We caught plenty more than 6, but well, we use a strong word here. I wasn't catching a ton of fish. Mine broke the. I have a lot to learn yet.
You're on your way.
But there were, in harvesting the raspberries even, and all these different things. I don't know. I can't really articulate what it is that feels so good about it. Like when we were harvesting mushrooms last year, and even like wild like dandelion, you know, to put in salads and all these things. What is it that feels so good about it, or feels so cool?
I don't know. It's very, very deep, I think, in almost the human, like just how your brain operates and like data and information that's just stored from, you know, so long of like people actually like persisting that way. It just like almost awakens an area of your brain that you just don't really, I won't say like really use, but pathways or like memories that you're able to kind of recover.
Yeah.
It's really quite strange.
Yeah, it's really satisfying. I think growing your own food is really satisfying. But I think that, like, foraging is more, like, immediate. You know? Like, you don't have to, you put in the work in looking for it, and then when you find it, it's like, you know? It just, I don't know, it, like, makes the monkey mind feel really good.
Yeah, definitely. it's definitely something that I think more people need to do. I mean, if nothing else, just to recognize how much food they actually need, like what Barron said. I mean, like the requirements for us to actually persist, and how blatantly we overconsume without understanding where it came from. I mean, like, if Barron would have just snuck into the huckleberry jar that we just picked, like, and he just like eats all of them, like that's 2 hours of picking huckleberries, like that's significant.
An issue. Yeah.
And
Now
then
we have tribal warfare.
yeah, and then now looking at it like how we eat food now, and it's not something. It almost gets back to like that whole like ceremonial perspective, like something where it's like you understand the time that went into actually like harvesting or like picking, in the case of the berries, whatever food you're eating. And so you respect it more for what that is, as opposed to the quantity of it, or how much you had in your mind, how much you like wanted to eat. It becomes more satisfying just because of what it is.
Yeah. What's interesting too is even if you're buying your food, you're still investing some time. But that sort of time to receive food, translation is abstracted away. So you no longer have that like direct exchange,
That's what credit cards are for. You can eat whatever you want.
Right. But it's interesting how that it doesn't feel as good. It doesn't feel as good to go buy a trout at a restaurant as it does to catch it on your own, like figure that fish out, catch it, like kill it with kindness, and or like at least respect the fish, and then prepare it over a fire and eat it. It's like it's gratifying,
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that it's a good start in recognizing where our food comes from and realizing the huge gaps of understanding in our current system.
Yeah.
And I think that it becomes kind of one of those like slippery slopes, but in a good way, in that as soon as you start to really ask a lot of these deeper questions and start to actually experience a life that's different or removed from what you were told it had to be, it was just a game, and that you needed to like grow up and like do something that, was actually like valuable. You really, I think you're really opened up into what's possible and like the reality of things.
Which is can be a little bit frightening for people once you open up that can of worms.
Yeah.
But I think if you lean into it, it's a beautiful thing,
Yeah, definitely.
Because we're not just here to work and die. Like we're here to experience and like live with all this and help life continue to persist.
Yeah.
And we got a fair shake at doing it. We just got to try pretty hard.
Extremely hard.
Yeah.
But there's always ants.
So hopefully we will be able to get together again soon and continue this conversation, because we have plenty to talk about in the realm of neuroscience and
whatever you guys want to talk about.
all different things.
Yeah.
So we'll be back, but for now, let's call it and get some sleep. I think we might go to Glacier National Park tomorrow and then go fishing afterward or something. So
yeah, sounds good to me.
Cool. Well, thanks, dude.
Yeah, not a problem.
And if people want to like reach out to you and geek out on anything, just don't. Or do you want to give them any information?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
How to get a hold of you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Include a way to get a hold of me. I think it's absolutely fascinating to take different perspectives and different knowledge bases and kind of combine them and see what comes of it. I love being able to be that that force to other people, and if I can get that from you as well, that definitely helps me. I love being able to see different avenues and then be able to mutually respond with you as well. So
cool. So Instagram, is that a decent way to contact you?
Yeah, whatever.
What's your Instagram handle?
It's just Andrew A. Crowe, Crowe.
No underscores or anything?
No.
Okay, cool. And then do you have a website or anything? Yes, you have a blog.
Yeah.
But I haven't even had a chance to read it yet.
We're gonna
which I'm
let
a little sad
Baron.
about.
We're gonna let Baron read through that one first. I'm a little
Okay.
bit hesitant of doing that one yet.
Okay, well, I'll have a link to his blog in the show notes.
It's actually on my Instagram too.
Okay, cool. Well, until next time, thanks, man.
Yeah, not
Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank
It's
you for
been
having
great.
me.
Okay, have a wonderful day, y'all.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to this episode. For more information and links to the things we talked about, check out our show notes at nomad.com/podcast. If you want to see more of what we're up to, we've documented our travels on YouTube for the past 3 years and are up to 250,000 subscribers. Check it out at youtube.com/elsaray. Please give us a 5-star review if you like the show so other people can find it. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.